So drilling down into the Tomcat servlet engine configuration then, this diagram reminds you of how it's all set up. You've got your browser, an optional web server in the middle here, and then your app server here, which has got the WAS web application server functionality, Tomcat, i.e. taking the requests and forwarding any dynamic content requests to the Urouter, which uses the server to deliver it. As I said, we actually supply a Tomcat with Uniface. If you want to install your own, that's very quick and easy. And you just need to copy the libwrd.jar from the Uniface installation that we provide to your new Tomcat, restart the service, and you're good. You can use it with your new Tomcat, no problem. So these contexts or virtual directory are just defined by creating a file in a standard Tomcat folder, so conf Catalina localhost. As I said, remember it's case sensitive, so if I create webstart.xml, that will actually give me my server /webstart in the URL up above. And then the way that actually maps to a physical folder is just via a context doc-based attribute inside that file. So we can see it just below here, and we're pointing directly to a web subfolder of my project. Obviously don't want to share the whole project because that's got all my Uniface build and my configuration files, but just the web folder, which has got my static content in it that I want to serve from the web, plus my configuration of how to talk to Uniface. The Valve thing here is optional, and it's just telling Tomcat to log certain requests in the Tomcat log folder. That's all it is. We can comment that out or turn it off if we want. It's worth noting perhaps that Uniface will, we've made a couple of optimizations to the Tomcat that we supply. So, somebody's just requesting control. I'll get rid of that. So we don't automatically monitor those for configuration changes, which the default Tomcat would do. So if you do make changes, you'll need to just restart the service typically. If you're using your own vanilla Tomcat installation, you can make changes and it will just monitor them. So moving on. My web physical folder will contain a webinf directory that contains web.xml. That's the file that says how to map the URL to the Uniface connection. So when we say webstart/wrd, that's going to define the WRD and how it works. And then that in turn says how to talk to the Urouter. So let me show you that. If you open that webinf web.xml file, you'll see a definition of the WRD servlet. This will be defined by default in the Uniface context that we provide when you install Uniface. And if you look down below, you'll see the middleware parameter, and we're connecting to the local machine. You can see on a standard 1301 port. That might be different if we've got multiple Uniface installations. We say how to connect to the server, username and password, and then we give a UST, a named configuration, web start here. The other little bit at the end of the file to note is that there is a servlet mapping which maps the URL to that configuration. So if I don't like WRD, I could change that to prod or web or something else to suit my requirements. Okay. One other thing to note is that dynamic server pages, obviously there's two parts to that functionality. There's Uniface server functionality, but there's also functionality that runs in the web browser that does the data synchronization and talks back to the Uniface server. Now, you obviously need that in your running application, and by default Uniface will look at that in the common folder. So if I say I want WRD/main, I run my main DSP, then going up a level we'll get rid of the WRD, and then we're going to common, and then we're loading a static resource, uniface.js. Now, for that to work, I've got to do one of several things. I can either copy my Uniface web application common folder from the default Uniface installation to mine. Although if I've got multiple applications, this does mean that if I upgrade my version of Uniface, I've got to go and copy that again. So what you might prefer to do, certainly what I often do in development, is install the standard Uniface context or virtual directory and just tell Uniface that this can be found there. So that's what this Uniface runtime base URL setting does below. That just goes in your application server assignment file, and then Uniface will issue requests to say it's there. You can actually change this stuff as well via JavaScript and via the APIs. An alternative approach, if you don't want to do that, is you can actually create a virtual directory or context within another virtual directory, and that's all I'm doing below. So we created a web.xml. The hash or #common just says I've got another common folder inside that, and if I open that file and look at its doc base, that will point to a different location, which will be the Uniface web apps, Uniface Common, Uniface folder that we specified up the top. So it's just pointing to my Tomcat installation. Okay. So the Uniface middleware, Urouter.asn-server, typically will say where to write the Urouter log file. So if you get errors, that will typically be the first place to look. If you see something like server died, it's probably a server started and failed, maybe because of a configuration problem. You can look in your userver's log files then to see what went wrong. If you don't get one, either it didn't start or you've got a permissions problem and it couldn't write. Remember that the Uniface server runs typically as the userver user unless you change it. So the userver needs permissions to be able to write these logs, but not enough permissions to access things or update things that it shouldn't. The privmon user is for the Urouter monitor, which you should ideally use to deploy patches and so on, do a controlled, graceful reload of your configuration to the Urouter, for example. And a note here, if you're using a virtual machine, as I often do, and you're using something like network address translation, so your IP address is shared between the main server and my virtual machine, you might need to explicitly specify the host ID so that the Tomcat can successfully connect to the Urouter service. So if you're getting problems, that's one other thing to look at. You can sometimes get issues where you have multiple network interface cards as well. So just something to be aware of. I do give a troubleshooting list later on, which we'll run through. So when you install Uniface, you get some default servers. Here you can see we're running userver.exe from the Uniface installation. If it was a 32-bit installation, that would be program files x86. And rather than 10.2 here, that might say Uniface 10.201 if you chose the defaults. I just truncated that a little bit because when I patch Uniface, typically we'll change the subversion from 10.201 to 10.202, let's say. So I don't use those subversions in there. Now, if I was creating a new context or a new configuration, I'll typically just copy the wasv one here and just give it a different name like web start, and I'll change the working directory, that's the /dir switch, to the directory of my new project. Note also here that the assignment file wasv.asn is a relative path, that's relative to the dir switch, so it will look in that folder that I specify with the dir switch. If it can't find it, it will then look in the Uniface ADM folder, which needs to find all of the Uniface standard configuration. So you'll just be adding extra ones in here typically and restarting the Urouter service, or doing a graceful reload in a better way using the Urouter monitor. Some notes about those switches. If you look at the debugger one here, you'll see that it has a max equals 1. Here you go. So if you look at the bottom there, you can see the max equals 1. That's because when you're debugging, obviously each request will possibly go to a different application server, your server for instance, and obviously it would get very confused because you can't keep a debugger session running over different servers. For a deployment application, I would recommend that you actually work out how many Uniface servers concurrently your server can comfortably handle. This obviously depends upon the size of your application and its memory usage and how powerful your server is and the resources it has. But I find generally if you set that, let's say it was 100 servers, to something that the server can handle without disk swap into memory and so on. You can use the performance monitor on your machine to check that. Then what will happen is that everyone that's within those limits will get a decent response and other people will queue. That's probably better than everyone sort of slowly degrading to the point that nothing works. So if you do that, then Uniface will just keep those servers around and reuse them. And if you've got enough memory, that's not a problem. And then you don't have an overhead in starting new servers once it's loaded up. You can even tell Uniface up front that you want to start some in advance. The max idle is typically used to close servers when they haven't been used for a while, so to deal with spikes. But my advice is to only really use that if you haven't set max, because if you have set max, then just reusing an existing one is probably going to be quicker than actually the overhead of starting a new server, which will kind of have a ripple effect to the performance while it waits to start a new one. And max rec, number of requests you can execute, is typically only used if you've got a memory leak, let's say because you've got a C component with a memory leak that you're calling out to, or you're short of memory. So it'll force Uniface servers to restart after a number of requests, but I generally wouldn't recommend using it unless you've got a problem. Only other considerations, so if you're sharing one Urouter, more in a development environment and people are using lots of debuggers, and you might decide to have a different port per user. On a deployment application you probably wouldn't do that, although you might configure, for example, a logging configuration which is not generally used, which in the case of issues you can actually use to do a bit of diagnostics and a bit of testing via a different URL without having to go and reconfigure it all to make that work. So there's some things you can do in advance just in case when you've got a support issue, for example. Plenty of other switches, it's all in the help. So when you come to deploy your application, you'll use a web application server file, wasv.asn or whatever you want to call it. Very similar to development, but obviously you want to change a few things. If you're using test mode components, which forces reload of the component, it effectively does the same as drop from memory. Useful when you're developing, because if I make a change I just want to pick it up immediately, but that's a performance overhead reloading it every time in a deployment application, so you'll probably comment that out or turn it off. You're obviously not going to be building to an archive file or resources folder for a deployment application, so no need to specify some of the other things. The web section, a lot of these used to be in the settings section. I think a lot of them will still work if you put it there, but remember that the server secret is used to hash protect no edit fields. So if I've got a command button, for example, and it says commit or store or something like that, you want to protect from malicious users trying to modify that in a web browser debugger to inject some JavaScript to steal your ID or something. And Uniface will do all of that nice stuff for you automatically. It will hash all of the non-editable fields and compare it when you submit the form back, and it will give you an error if there's a problem. But it will only do that if you specify the server secret. So that's always set by default when you install Uniface. Just make sure if you create a new assignment file that you copy that into your deployment one, so that you get some kind of key used to create that hash. The other two settings here in the web section are just basically the runtime base URL. Where do I find the Uniface resources like Uniface.js? You can say, for example, /Uniface/common instead, and then whether you're using HTTPS or HTTP, it's still going to work. If you've moved it to somewhere else, you'll change that. Otherwise, you'll probably leave it alone. You don't even need to specify them. And the JS base URL is where the JavaScript that you've compiled into your components can be found. Now in this case we're looking at where it is from a URL perspective, i.e. here we've used the default common folder for Uniface and put them there, but you might want to do something different. When you're compiling in your development environment, that's specified in a useit setting. JavaScript equals my folder name. But at runtime, this is where, relative to my components, do I find that JavaScript. So you can change it to something else. It doesn't have to be common. It could be my DSP.js folder. So I'd get rid of common out of there. Resources then is just where we actually put our compiled components, all my objects. In this example, I'm using a UAR file, which is basically a zip of a folder. You could actually specify a folder name instead. Either works, so whichever you prefer, really. I mentioned troubleshooting earlier. If something doesn't work, this is typically how I go about. So if you're doing it the first time, you know, it's quite easy to make a typo or something. So this is how I go about determining what's wrong. I typically use my browser debugger if something isn't loading once I've done a deployment, and just check that all the static files are loading. If they're not, then I know I've misconfigured something. Typically the networks tab will show you all the files that are loaded as you do it, when you make a request. I'll check that Tomcat is running and that I can actually request the static resources, like my JavaScript or my images, just in a web browser. If that's good, I know Tomcat's okay, and then I would actually do a dynamic request, and if that's working, I should see some kind of screen. If I see a red screen, I know that I've probably got a configuration error. If I see a yellow screen, I know that it's probably configured okay, but we've got some kind of runtime error. Maybe because there's some configuration missing. Maybe I haven't deployed my form. I would check the middleware connection. If you comment out the middleware connection and restart your Tomcat, and then just actually request any form, Uniface will give you a middleware response that just shows you that the middleware is listening. So then you can actually restart it with the middleware connection and try it. If it's still failing, I would just look at the ports, the credentials, the named configuration, and see if there's a problem. If you copy it from a development environment, it may be that the paths are slightly different, or my ports are different, or my login is different. So you just compare them and make sure they're right. Following that, I'll just look at my Uniface configuration, check that the named configuration, the UST, matches what I specified, check that I've got a host name if I'm in a VM or something, look at log files, look at my Urouter assignment file, my userver file. If I don't have a log file, well, it probably either didn't start. We can use Urouter monitor, or the process monitor, you know, on a task manager in Windows, to see whether it's actually doing anything. If it looks like it's starting but still not writing a log file, you've probably got a permissions issue. So remember that the Uniface server, by default, the service will run as the userver user. You can check the effective permissions for the Uniface server user for that path, and just check they've got the right permissions that you need. And of course, if you haven't got a valid license, it's going to complain. So you just want to also just check that you've got a valid license using the Urouter monitor, look at the log files, etc.